I'm Tara from Transition Bikes, and it's new bike day. To ensure an accurate rider suspension setup, make sure you get all your gear ready to go. Next, here's all the tools that I need to set up my suspension. A floor pump with a gauge, a ruler preferably with millimeters, and a shock pump. Next, I'm going to pump up my tires to my desired PSI. Now I'm going to set up the rear shock. To start, I'm going to pump up my shock to the recommended pressure for my body weight. I'm going to equalize the negative and positive air chamber by cycling through the suspension. I'll also make sure that my climb switch is in the open position. Now I'm ready to check sag. I'll make sure my bike is in a flat spot. Time to lower my saddle and move the O-ring down to the seals. Time for me to climb on the bike, sit down on the seat without bouncing, and take my feet off the ground. I'm making sure my fingers are off the brakes during this process. After I carefully dismount my bike, I'm going to measure the distance between the O-ring and my dust seal. Where can I find the recommended sag for my bike? It's on the back of my seat tube. Something to note, if I had RockShox suspension, the sag ratings are printed right on the shock, so I don't need a ruler. My sag looks pretty dialed here. If it was above or below, I'd adjust using a shock pump. Now it's time to move on to the fork. Just as I did with my rear suspension, I'm going to pump up my fork to the recommended pressures, which can be found on the inside of my lowers. To set up my fork, I'll use a slightly different process than I did with my rear suspension. And while I'm still in the parking lot, I'm going to perform a bounce test to feel balance between my front and rear suspension. If my fork felt much harder or softer than my rear suspension, I'll adjust the air pressure accordingly. Now that I have my sag set up and my fork is feeling balanced, all I have to do is set the rebound and compression settings. Those recommended settings can be found on the Transition Bikes website. I'm excited to go ride my new bike, and I'll bring a shock pump with me in case I need to do any on-trail adjustments. Now before I drop in, I'm going to make sure that my suspension is fully open and I reset those O-rings back down to the dust seals. After riding some trail, I'm going to check where my O-rings are on my suspension. If I've used too much, I'm going to add a little more air. If I haven't used enough, I'm going to take a little air out. For the type of trail I was riding, it looks like I've used about 85% of my travel. I didn't have too many big compressions, so I'm pretty happy with where I'm at right now. All right, I just got done with my ride. I'm feeling pretty dialed on the suspension. I'm going to keep an eye on the O-rings for the next couple rides and adjust from there.